hearts of the people that are here, and we lift up Bart this morning in the message that he has prepared for us, and pray that his words would be your words, and that the message again would move in the people that are here. And Father, now as we go to our time of offering, we just pray that again that we thank you for the blessings that you have given us this past week, and pray that we would in turn bless others with these gifts, and that you would show us, Father, how you would have us best use these gifts in order to further your kingdom. In Jesus' name, amen. Would the ushers please come forward? Please stand and sing with us, Joy to the World.
Today, on the third Sunday of Advent, we light the candle of love. First John, chapter 4, verses 7 through 11 says this, Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. And whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he has loved us, and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. We light the candle of love to remember that God's love for us was so powerful that he sent his only Son from heaven to us. And to remember that if we have received that love, then we are then called to share it with others.
Please stand and sing with us, please.
Remember what we're singing? just about the baby coming. It's about he came so he could live and die and rise again, and we have the hope of heaven. And we know he's coming back. So if you'd like to sing with us, we want to add a verse to this little light of mine. Ready? Shine it until Jesus comes. I'm gonna let it shine. Shine it until Jesus comes. I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Thank you. Other way around.
This is called And There Was Light, Emmanuel.
In the beginning, all was darkness, brooding, nothingness, just dark.
And God said,
Let there be
Light!
light.
And with the light came
Growing things,
grass and wheat,
lentils and lilies.
fish of many colors.
and God said,
Good. Very good.
Yes, very good.
Things didn't go so well.
Everyone did what was right.
Everyone
in their
did
own
what was
Right
eyes.
in their own eyes.
And one by one, important things disappeared.
Loyalty, promise, truthfulness,
And one by one, strange things appeared.
fear, hunger, hatred.
And God said,
You need help.
No, we don't.
and God said,
I'll send you some help.
Nope, we're good.
and God said,
Help is on the way.
We don't need it.
I'm sending it along with the light.
We prefer the dark.
I'm sending it along with love.
Oh, please. We prefer not to work that hard.
I'm sending a baby.
Oh, what?
A baby.
You think a
Baby is going to help?
A helpless little child. A human child. He will be rejected and despised.
A baby?
He will be acquainted with grief.
A helpless widow baby? Oh.
I'm sending you help.
Oh, yeah? When's this itty bitty widow baby coming along? Eh?
Not yet.
Better be soon, 'cause we need it.
Not yet.
Are you sure the baby's coming?
When all things are ready.
So how's that working for you?
God,
Where'd you go? I'm talking to you.
all the world should be registered.
Right.
This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered.
Right.
Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David.
Right.
Joseph went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child.
Right.
And God said, "Let there be light."
And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in bands of cloth, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn.
And there was light, a baby.
Wow.
There were rumors about a baby.
A baby bringing help.
Help, let's face it, we have some troubles.
I don't want to be scared no more.
Hungry no more. Fight no more. Suffer no more. Help.
The baby will grow, help. He will grow, he will show you the strongest loyalty, the firmest promises, the deepest truth.
Yet the darkness continued, but we were no longer alone. And so the darkness lifted,
Yet our fears kept growing,
but we were no longer alone.
and so the fear lessened,
Yet our hunger hit us hard,
but we were no longer alone.
and so we tasted friendship,
Yet our hatred intensified,
but we were no longer alone.
and enemies sang songs together.
One day the baby will remove all fear, hunger, and hatred.
We look forward to that day. We look forward to that day. We are not alone.
Oh, I forgot to tell you the baby's name.
What is it?
Emmanuel,
Emmanuel. What does it mean?
God with us.
Really? Wow. Who knew? God with us. God with us. We are no longer alone. Good. Very good.
That was cool. Thank you, everybody. For some reason, these being up just kind of gets in my head. All right, let's pray as we get into the lesson for today. Father, we thank you for this chance to gather together to talk about this extraordinary event. Emmanuel, God with us, how you came to be with us, to live with us, to start this whole redemption process 2,000 years ago. We thank you for your word and what it teaches us about what happened at that time and how important it is to us. I pray now that as we dig into your word a little bit today, that you would guide us and be with us, and that my words would be yours. In your name we pray. Amen. So last week when I mentioned that we were going to do one more week on our Psalm study before we got into a Christmas study, I got a lot of confused faces from the crowd. It's Advent and he's not talking about Christmas. Well, this week we're talking about Christmas. So for those of you who, that wasn't your favorite, I'm sorry. I did kick around for several weeks in my head what we were going to talk about this year at Christmas, and finally I think settled on a direction we were going to go, and it was one of those times where I wasn't sure. I think we'll do this, I'm still not sure, and then a whole bunch of things just sort of fall into place to sort of say this is where God is directing us. So want to spend some time this week and next week talking about one specific character in the Christmas story, one that I think sometimes we always recognize and we always see him. He certainly takes a prominent role in the story as a whole, but him specifically, we tend to miss in some details, and I think for some good reasons, so we'll get into that. But the character that I want to talk about the next couple of weeks is that of Joseph. And I've got a little video. If you will be patient, I will pull it up.
Sweetie, are you listening?
Mary, I've said it once, I'll say it again. I can do two things.
Two things at once, yes, I know. But we really need to talk. And, Joseph,
Yeah,
I need you to listen.
I am listening so hard right now. You can't even imagine how much I'm concentrating on you and words.
I'm overwhelmed by your concentration. Can you just stop for a second, please?
Mary, I would love to stop for a second, but I can't.
Why not?
We're gonna be married soon, and I just want everything to be perfect.
Joseph, I love your heart. I really do, but not everything has to be perfect, and that's okay because we don't know what life is gonna throw at us,
Right, but I still want a house worthy of you, and to do that, I've got to work, because a man
has got to have a plan.
Have I mentioned that before?
A time or two.
Mary, I have so many plans for us. This table, this is where we're going to have our meals together, and I've made it big enough for to seat some little ones. For down the road, of course.
About that.
We're going to put that chisel.
Joseph, I need to tell you something. Something unbelievable.
Did I put it in that shelf?
I was visited by an angel.
Yeah?
And he told me that I was highly favored.
Mm-hmm.
And it felt like a dream until he told me something. And the instant he said it, I knew that it was true.
I just used it. I just had it.
Joseph, are you listening to me?
That sounds really great.
Joseph.
Got it.
I'm pregnant.
So, I like that video because we're sort of trying to get into the mind of Joseph in this story. And as we look at it, we find that he's this really interesting character, really, in the whole of the gospel. He's Jesus Christ's dad, at least on earth. And that's got to be a really interesting role to play. But the reality is, in almost every situation that we find him in, he's a background character. He's there, but he's not up front. He's not driving anything. In the Christmas story, the story centers largely on Mary, on Jesus, on the activity, and he's always there, but he's sort of on the side. And then once we get out of the Christmas story, he's almost completely non-existent to the rest of the Bible. So some background and what do we know about him? He's very likely a carpenter. We say likely because while he is referenced as a carpenter, that word in the original language can mean more than simply somebody who works with wood, like we often think. But in all likelihood, he's at the very least in some form of construction or work like that. He's mentioned several times, as we said, in the Christmas story, so let's walk through what those look like. First time we see him mentioned is in the opening genealogy, where they're setting the table, so to speak, for Jesus' birth and his descendancy from David. And so we see the family line in one place of Mary and another of Joseph as descendants of David. We then see him mentioned that he is engaged to be married to Mary, and that's always the phrasing that's hard. He's going to marry Mary. Stick with it, though. There's some confusion sometimes over that idea of marriage. In some places he's referred to as engaged. In some places they say married. That's because marriage in that time is a very long, drawn-out process that often takes well over a year of preparing and planning, and there's different stages along the way. From what we can tell in this story, they are getting towards the end. They're starting to approach the final celebration service that they would do, and everything would be formalized and complete. That's why you can say that they're engaged and they were going to get a divorce at the same time. Because they are engaged, I think that initially tells us a little bit something about Joseph, though. He is engaged to Mary, and Mary is highlighted because of her faith. She is favored by God because of her heart, because of her faithfulness. And as we see the things that she says and the things that we do, we see how extraordinary this young woman is. And the fact that Joseph would pick her to be his wife, I think, says something. He puts a value on that faithfulness, on her faith, on her belief in God. I think that shows his heart, in a sense. The next step that we see in the story with Joseph is that after he finds out that Mary shows up and is pregnant, that he decided to divorce her. Now, he had several options at that point. And essentially what he chose was the kindest, gentlest way to move forward. He could have had her shamed. He could have had her thrown out of town. He even could have had her killed because of her unfaithfulness. But he still cared about her. He still wanted to treat her gently, so he was going to quietly divorce her and step away and make it as calm and gentle as possible. Again, I think, showing something of his character and his heart. Next, though, an angel comes and speaks to him, telling him that he should continue in that marriage process with Mary because that child is truly from God. And that after the child is born, that he should name him Jesus. And it says that when he hears that, despite the incredible circumstances, the unbelievable nature of this moment, and despite the fact that there would be some very, very public consequences, not only for Mary, but for him if he continued with that process, it says that he obeyed. He did what he was told. He followed through. Following that, Joseph led a very pregnant Mary to Bethlehem, a trip of around 90 miles by foot and by donkey. Because of that Roman census, they were required to go. He brought her with, got her all the way there. The hard work that it would have taken to move a pregnant wife that far had to have been incredible. And once they finally got to Bethlehem, he searched the town so that he could find a stable to at least provide some shelter for the coming of Jesus. Following that, it says that he took Jesus and presented him at the temple in Jerusalem as was required by the Old Testament law, and there he met Simeon and Anna. Following that, the next time we see Joseph pop up in the story, it says that an angel spoke to him and directed him to take Mary and Jesus to Egypt, to become refugees, in a sense, to avoid Herod, who was going to come and try and find and kill Jesus. And then later, the angel came back to him and said, okay, it's time for you to return to Israel. And Joseph led Mary and Jesus back to Israel and eventually to Nazareth. We see in that process that God was entrusting Mary and Jesus to Joseph, trusting that Joseph would take care of them, would lead them, protect them. So that's essentially Joseph in the Christmas story. After the Christmas story, we see him a little bit. We see him mentioned a couple times. There's one story that sits between the ministry of Jesus and the birth of Jesus. That is when Joseph didn't probably have his proudest parenting moment. He and Mary had taken Jesus to the temple. And then they and their caravan was on the way home, and they get part of the way out of town. They'd been walking for a while and realize, oh shoot, we forgot that Son of God in the big city of Jerusalem. And so they rush back, and they find Jesus in the temple. And the story doesn't mention Joseph by name, actually. It says Jesus' parents. So it would include him. They get there, and you have this, what could be interpreted as a very harsh statement that Jesus makes. They finally find him, and it says that Mary asks him, or makes a statement to him, what are you doing? Why aren't you with us? And this is Jesus' response. Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? Imagine being Joseph and hearing that. That's sort of one step away from, you're not my real dad. But Joseph knows this. So 12 years after the birth, Jesus and Joseph are still together. There's one, that is the last reference to Joseph being alive. There's one other story, possibly two stories, that refer to Jesus. Luke chapter 3, verse 23. Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son, as was supposed, of Joseph. It's another one of those little digs. At this time, though, it would appear that that Joseph is dead. Matthew 13 says this, and when Jesus had finished these parables, he went from there, and coming to his hometown, he taught them in their synagogue. So they were astonished and said, where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas, and are not all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things? And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown and his own household. He did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. So again, Joseph's not mentioned by name, but he's referred to here as the carpenter. Maybe the same story, maybe a different story, but the Gospel of John, chapter 6, says this. And they said, is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How does he now say, I've come down from heaven? And so now that's it for Joseph in the Bible. That's all we've got. There's a little bit of material there. There's a few stories, but there's not a ton. There's just enough to sort of tease our imagination on who this guy was. What kind of man was he? What was he thinking? What was he feeling? What was it like to be the father of the Son of God? The Catholics go an interesting direction with Joseph. I think worth mentioning here a little bit. A lot of what they do with Joseph is sort of the result of a doctrine they have called the doctrine of perpetual virginity of Mary. Their belief is that not only did Mary conceive Jesus as a virgin, but remained a virgin for the rest of her life. This provides some interesting ideas for the husband of Mary. So they have some doctrines that are founded on some early church apocryphal writings or extra biblical writings. And it develops a picture of Joseph that's very different than the one that we as Protestants tend to have. Here's an excerpt from the Catholic Encyclopedia under the listing of St. Joseph. It will not be without interest to recall here, unreliable though they are, the lengthy stories concerning St. Joseph's marriage contained in the apocryphal writings. When 40 years of age, Joseph married a woman, then lived 49 years together, and had 6 children, 2 daughters and 4 sons, the youngest of whom was James, the less, the Lord's brother. A year after his wife's death, as the priests announced through Judea that they wished to find in the tribe of Judah a respectable man to espouse Mary, then 12 to 14 years of age, Joseph, who was at the time 90 years old, went up to Jerusalem among the candidates. A miracle manifested the choice God had made of Joseph, and 2 years later, the Annunciation took place. So essentially what they believed was Joseph was married, had a bunch of kids, his wife died, he lived to be 90 years old, and the priests found out that God's son was coming to Mary. They were looking for a husband for him, found this 90-year-old guy. That sort of takes care of that whole perpetual virginity thing. And it explains how a woman can be a virgin for the whole of her life, yet not only have the Son of God, but the brothers and sisters of God as well. Essentially, then James, the brother of Jesus, was not a brother, but a half-brother, and not even a half-brother, because they aren't actually related by blood at all. It does seem to me to be a very long way to go to solve a problem that only exists because of this unnecessary doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary. But it's a different picture of Joseph, a 90-year-old man that marries a 14-year-old girl. I don't think anybody would look at that really clear-eyed today, but that's that. It seems far more likely to me, and it would be far more culturally typical of their day, that Mary would have been in her early to mid-teens. That tended to be the time that girls got married. Joseph would have been somewhere in his late 20s to early 40s, depending on his family position, finances. They would get married when they can, but they had to make sure that they had a stable base for a family, so they tended to be a little bit older. When the Bible mentions that Joseph didn't know her before Jesus was born, because of the brothers and sisters, it would seem that situation was resolved shortly after the birth of Jesus. So in that picture, then, we have Joseph as a real, typical man. He had plans, he had hopes, he had dreams, he had set the stage and prepared to have a family for years. He had picked out a special woman to be his wife that would be part of that family. He'd been preparing the home specifically for at least a year for her to come and live with him. He had family, he had friends, he had neighbors that he had seen go through this same marriage process before. He knew how it worked. He knew what it looked like. He knew what to expect. Those had gotten married, some had happy marriages, others had problems. He knew some couples that were so lovey-dovey that it made him sick. He knew others that were constantly bickering and arguing. But Joseph was a godly man. He believed, he had faith. He resolved to follow God the best he could. He had picked a godly wife that mirrored his beliefs and ideas. When they got married, they would love and respect one another. They would raise kids to believe as they did, that would fear God, that would follow the Torah. When they got married, they would live next door to his parents. They would be just down the street from his in-laws. He would teach his trade to his sons. Teach them how to work with their hands, how to work with the wood the way he did. Mary would teach the important household tasks to their daughters. The kids would grow. Eventually, they would set out on their own. They would get married on their own. They would give Mary and Joseph grandkids. On Saturday, they'd all go to synagogue together. Then afterwards, they'd go back to Joseph's home, where Mary would have something that wasn't ham in the crock pot, and they'd all sit down for lunch. That was the way life was supposed to go. Joseph had that in his head. He knew what to expect. The problem is God didn't expect that. God had a plan. It was something much bigger, much different than all of that. But God does that a lot. He likes to shake things up. He likes to go against our expectations because he knows better. Think about the patriarchs, the fathers of the nation of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, when God calls him to be the father of his people, is an idol maker. We have no reason to think he even knew who Yahweh was, let alone worshiped him. But God said, you're the one that I'm going to pick to bring my nation from. And then he says, you're going to have so many descendants that they're going to number greater than the stars in the sky. But then Abraham hits 90 years old and he doesn't have any kids. And so he and his wife come up with this plan, and finally he has his firstborn son, Ishmael. God says, He doesn't count. That's not the one. And it's another 10 years before finally Abraham has Isaac. And God says that's the one. The one. It's hard to get to stars in the sky numbers from one. But that's what happens. Why? Because God does what God's going to do. And that one, Isaac, grew up, has the same promise given to him that his father had. Your descendants will number the stars in the sky. He has 2 kids. The first one, the one that's supposed to receive the promise, God says, yeah, he doesn't count. Esau doesn't count. Jacob, the one. That's not how things were supposed to go. That's not how the world looks at it and says, this is the way it goes. According to the world, Isaac and Jacob shouldn't be the patriarchs of Israel. Israel should be Ishmael and Esau. They are supposed to be the ones that God chooses, but they weren't. God doesn't follow the world's rules. He doesn't follow the expectations. He does what he knows is best, even when it seems ridiculous to us. Here's how Paul puts that idea in the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 1, verses 25 and 29. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. God does things that seem foolish, they seem insane, but the reality is the lowest thoughts of God are higher than anything we can imagine. And so what he does, it's counterintuitive, it doesn't make a lot of sense, it certainly doesn't go along the lines of our plans. It is good, and it is right, and it is the best. See, by human standards, a Messiah that would be born, that would come from God, is going to be born into a family that you know. It's one of those noble, well-established, well-thought-of families. Distinguished. People who are known for their wisdom, for their faithfulness, for their belief and their strength. He would be born in a palace. That's what the wise men assumed, right? They take that whole trek, and where do they go? They go to the capital, they go to the palace, because well, where else would the king, the Son of God, the Messiah, where else would he be? I mean, that all makes sense, right? But that's not how it works. It's not what God did. See, by those same human standards, a young girl who is engaged but not married and gets pregnant, she's trouble, right? In that culture, a person like that is cast out. They're tossed out of the community. Sometimes they're even executed, because that's what the Torah says. She certainly wouldn't get married unless her fiancé continues and marries her, which essentially is an admission of guilt on his part, and so he would be equally ostracized alongside of her. They would get what they deserved because they did what was wrong. Joseph knew all of this. He knew what the expectations were. He knew what the standards would be that would be held against them. He probably would have agreed with all of them right up until all of a sudden he's on the other side. All of this happens to him. Then all of his expectations, all of his assumptions, all of his plans, what was going to happen, it all goes out the window. When Mary shows up pregnant, everything that he had of his hopes and his dreams, gone. I can't even begin to imagine what would have gone through his mind over those days and weeks and months and years. And we aren't really given any insight to it. Mary speaks quite a lot. She has her Magnificat, this beautiful poetic passage where we see her heart, we see her faithfulness. There's several other places where she speaks and you can see what's going on in her mind, what's going on in her heart. You look through the entire gospel record, there are no words recorded that came from Joseph. Not a one. He never speaks in any of the stories. But what is recorded, what we do see, are his actions. And we see the results of those actions. In Matthew chapter 1, it says that angel came to Joseph and told him what was happening and what Joseph should do. Here's what it says in verse 24. When Joseph woke from his sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. A chapter later, angel speaks to Joseph again. Chapter 2, verse 14. And he rose and he took the child, his mother, by night, and he departed to Egypt. A few verses later, angel speaks to him again. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. And that's what we see over and over and over again from Joseph. When God tells him to do something, he just does it. He doesn't need to talk about it. He doesn't need to say anything. He simply does what God tells him to do. And that's easy to just sort of say and gloss over, but the reality is things that God are telling Joseph to do are incredibly difficult things. They're things that are going to have consequences that Joseph fully understands immediately. Take someone who is going to be labeled as an adulteress as your wife. Now take your wife and your newborn and go be refugees in another country. Now that you've got settled in that other country, pick everything up and go back home where you know you're going to be ostracized because they know your story. God tells him to do all these incredibly difficult things, but he remains faithful every single time, and he simply does it. And in all of it, he remains focused on God. He knows what God has commanded in the law. He knows what is expected of him as a father, of them as a family. And he does it. He circumcises the baby exactly the way it's supposed to be done. He takes the baby to the temple exactly the way it's supposed to be done. He teaches him about God. Can you imagine being Joseph and teaching the Bible to his son, and every time you come across that phrase, the God the Father, you go, yeah, that's definitely true. You imagine the pressure that would have been on there? But he does all that. He does more. He teaches Jesus. He nurtures him. He loves him. Luke chapter 2, what his thoughts were on raising Jesus, I think he would point to this and probably say with pride, this is exactly what is right. It says, and the child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. This is exactly what all parents want for their children. To grow, to be strong, to be wise, to follow God and to be favored by God. Joseph can point to that and say, I did what I could do. He didn't get to live through it to see the end. Somewhere along the line, Joseph dies. We don't know how, we don't know why, we don't know where, we don't know the situation around it. We know at age 12, Jesus has Joseph, and at age 30, he doesn't. But Joseph does exactly what God had asked him to do. The beginning of the story, Mary shows up pregnant. Joseph saw his dreams of a perfect life shattered in a moment. But he doesn't give up. He doesn't allow that to jade him. He doesn't allow that to cause problems or rifts. He remains faithful through everything, despite all the difficulties and struggles that are going to come along the way. Things that literally no other man in human history will have to deal with. He dealt with them with courage and bravery and strength. And he played an important role, not only in the Christmas story, but in that larger, more important story of God taking on flesh and living among us and sacrificing himself, also that all of us, those of us who are alive today, those who were alive at the time, those who came before, even Joseph himself, so that all of us can be offered a way to have our sins forgiven, to be reconciled by God. Joseph's part in that process may have been sort of a side part, a background part. But it's my prayer that all of us would be as faithful to God's calling as Joseph was, no matter what's happening. Pray with me. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the picture that Joseph gives us. One of faithfulness, one of strength, one of integrity. A man who, despite the circumstances, despite things not going according to plan, he remained faithful. I pray that we would remain faithful. I pray that we would be strong and courageous to do what is right in any circumstance. And I pray that our hearts would be filled with joy, knowing that we're celebrating the coming of the King. The King who didn't come simply to be worshipped and adored, but who came for us. Be with us and bless us. In your name we pray. Amen.
Please stand and join us as we close our service today with Bart and Heralding.
Mercy
the benediction, I'm going to read a portion of Mary's Magnificat. The Lord has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate. He's filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. He's helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, and as he spoke to our fathers, to Abraham, and to his offspring forever. God is good. He cares for his people. He has spoken to us. And I pray that we would hear his message. Father, help us to hear what you have and what you are speaking to our hearts. I pray that we would each and every day be faithful to your word, to your calling, what you would have us do. Be with us and bless us. In your name we pray. Amen.